Life was simpler then. I lived in a quaint little house at the end of an innocent little cul-de-sac, right across from the main road. Everything I could ever want was at the edge of my fingertips. Any food could be found at one of our 3 farms, fresh marts or convenience stores. Any sports gear could be found at Joe McGee's Sports Emporium. Anything, whether necessary or merely desired, could be located, at most, a few miles away. Despite this, my mind would still wander on occasion. I'd become curious, a bit too curious for some people's liking. You see, unlike many others in the community, I wasn't ready to just pretend that the world before never existed. Though fleeting by the day, memories of a bygone era fastened themselves to my consciousness. 12 years had passed since, leaving 5 to misremember. But just as I would notice the degradation of my recollection, I'd hone in on the finest details. An auburn leaf dancing towards a jagged sea of yellow and green, brittle and misshapen, yet subsequently immaculate in its descent. The bittersweet tang of my father's coffee, the temperature of which intermittently singeing my tongue upon every sip I snuck. Needless to say, I was different. I was far more terrified of forgetting than I was of remembering. Every night, just as the sun began to set, I'd venture off to the edge of the dome, away from the saccharine reality that we'd all conformed to, away from the imitation trees and plastic dreams, to journey into the real world, albeit with my mind performing most of the work. I'd sit there at the edge of the transparent dome, recalling images of life before the war, before humanity was irreparably maimed. Visions of what once were family and friends dancing along to a tune, oh so welcoming to longing ears. Children playing baseball on an open field filled with real grass. However, those phantoms were but a fugitive thought to a weary mind, as looking out into the foreboding, barren wasteland I once called home only further roused apparitions of barbarity, destruction and anarchy. Regardless, those few seconds of joy, even knowing of the desolate backdrop behind them, made the experience worthwhile. My ability to recall certain memories faded over time, but I could always vividly remember the day we were rushed into the dome. My parents were very influential people before the war, and knew of the world's imminent, unavoidable expiration months before it occurred. Thus, when plans for a superdome, a habitat for an exclusive selection of humanity's survivors, was announced, they did all they could to send me in. The price to get one person into the dome was astronomical. Getting 3 would be impossible, even given my parents' incredible wealth at the time. They knew that they could barely afford 1 ticket, let alone 2 or 3. So they secured my safety at the sacrifice of their own. I was only about 7 years old at the time, and I couldn't fully comprehend the enormity of the circumstances. All I knew was that Mum and Dad were going on a vacation for a little while, and I got to stay in some extravagant hotel. Of course, when the bombs dropped, I was exposed to the ghastly reality of my situation. Fortunately, entry into the dome was well worth the asking price. As marketed, those who were granted admission were, in fact, the last surviving humans on Earth. The world outside was now too hazardous and defiled for human existence. so exiting the dome was a death wish, assuming such a feat would even be possible. The dome was sealed shut on all ends, with nothing but an emergency exit that could supposedly withstand any blast, weapon or temperature. The sole method of exit would be to utilize a key card that was only given to the highest ranking officials and gold member officers. This door would only be used under two circumstances: if a member of the community was facing exile, or if there was a catastrophic breach within the dome. In the rare event that there was such a breach and the door was opened, all gold member households contained life suits that would allow the person wearing the suit to survive healthily for up to 6 months in the foreboding wasteland on the outside. Luckily, given their multitude of connections, my parents were able to secure me a gold membership, hoping that I'd then be safe under any and all circumstances. My childhood essentially consisted of lessons in how to be a functioning member of the community, the dome's cruciality in my survival, and the consequences of disobedience within. Although not prohibited, it was not advised to go near the outer limits of the dome, as the transparent structure could serve as nothing more than a bleak reminder of our traumatic past, according to the officials in charge. Honestly, I can't blame them for claiming that either, as a lot of people's mental states were deteriorating, even without the constant reminders. Many inhabitants had gone through episodes of nomadic fever, as it's put, which in minor cases is nothing more than a passing bout of lunacy. But in more severe cases, it's a permanent illness that can lead to a plethora of consequences. It's not exactly known why this sickness occurs. Perhaps a combination of being confined to a dome and the constant reliance on near-palpable, artificial air can do a number on a person's psyche. One day, your neighbour Jim is your best friend. The next, he's trying to raid your house with a butcher knife, claiming that God has spoken to him. The only consistent symptom of the sickness is a tendency to incessantly ramble about forgotten people, though doctors always attributed this to delusion, speculating that those afflicted experience hallucinations of deceased loved ones as their condition develops, similar to what many people claim to witness on the brink of death. Everyone knew someone who'd suffered from the sickness, and only the luckiest among them knew survivors. Whether mentally stable or not, if you were considered a major threat to society, you were either executed or exiled from the community. As there was no prison system in place, this was just the easiest method of dealing with criminals and other threats. If you were lucky and didn't commit too heinous of a crime, you were executed in a relatively quick fashion. However, if you were a severe offender, you were exiled. At one point, I bore witness to the normally secretive expulsion procedure. It was late, far past curfew, and being out at this hour, especially with the goal of witnessing an exile, was an act that could lead to massive consequences. However, with all of the talk and all of the warnings since my first years in the dome, I had to see it with my own eyes, at least once. After word had spread about a murder spree committed by James Truefendale, and the verdict on his impending expulsion was announced, I knew I had a chance. I camped out by the official's office and waited for James's release from his cell. After a mechanical buzz and a shrill metallic clang, 3 men wearing life suits promptly walked out with James and carried him to the outermost western part of the dome. There wasn't a single light shining within any house or any lamp upon any street. therefore allowing my secrecy to be maintained. James was dragged out, confined to chains that were clamped far too tight for even the slightest bit of comfort, let alone circulation, as even from a distance, the otherwise inconspicuous veins in his arms shot out like wires. As he was being hauled, he was spewing every cuss in the book. How any family was able to stay asleep during this period is a mystery in itself. The trek to the dome's exit took about 15 minutes, the entirety of which was filled with obscenities and prophecies of forgotten people knowing the truth and that they will return. Hiding, I watched as the 3 suited officials walked into a secluded room containing the exit. I wasn't able to see what went on inside the room. I was only able to witness James being forcefully thrown out into the wasteland and the ensuing aftermath. After James was thrown out, the 3 officers nonchalantly strolled back to their office and didn't even pay James a passing glance. I kept my eyes fixated on him though, waiting for any noticeable changes. James immediately rose to his feet and seemingly desperately pleaded for his life. He banged his fists against the walls of the dome, bawling hysterically with the most immensely terrified expression I've ever seen in a man's eyes. Upon realizing his begging was to no avail, he began to continuously ram himself into the walls of the dome, whipping his head onto the structure until he had a crimson mask. I struggled to watch. He then abruptly began coughing and spluttering violently until he fell to the ground and started shaking as if he was having a seizure. His skin began to bubble, then pop, leading to splatters of blood and pus that dripped down the side of the dome. He attempted to stand up and prevent further masses of skin from boiling away, but he'd collapse soon after, the skin on his legs pooling off like butter under a blowtorch. His screams were inaudible due to the soundproof walls, but the sight of his jaw agape and of the flesh on his face melting from the bone made the sound of screaming ring within my head. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. Whether I was paralyzed with fear or simply going mad, I couldn't look away. The bloodied heap of flesh that remained slowly turned pitch black, almost as if it had been charred to the core with red spots appearing all over, encompassing much of his remaining flesh, bone, and near liquefied skin. Though he was now unable to maneuver his jaw to scream, the frantic movement of James's eyes illustrated to me that he remained both alive and suffering. Refusing to witness any more, I scurried back to my house undetected. As you'd expect, I managed not a wink of sleep that night and became petrified at the thought of life, or lack thereof, outside of the dome. It took me a few months to regain the courage to venture back to the edge, as eventually the urge to live in the past took hold yet again. Out of what I can only amount to morbid curiosity, I eventually returned to the scene. James's body was nowhere to be found. So there I sat, every night as the sun set, trying to expel dark memories and rejoice with the jovial ones. A constant battle, over and over again. I did this for years, until one fateful night when everything changed. I sat down on what they called a tree, aimlessly peering into the abyss, when I noticed something amid the encompassing darkness. Although hard to make out, I spotted a handprint upon the wall of the dome. Perplexed, I climbed down the tree and cautiously ambled over to the print. It was dusty and disfigured. There was something off about it, but I couldn't put my finger on exactly what. I'd never seen a marking on the walls, as every substance that touched it either bounced, dripped, or slid off without leaving a trace. Naturally, I was confused and attempted to wipe it away. I did this a few times, yet nothing happened. It was at this moment that I realized something that broke me to my core. I realized that the handprint came from outside. Bewildered, I staggered backward and darted all the way back to my house and into my bedroom, trying to convince myself that I was merely in a part of some twisted dream. Eventually, my heart rate slowed, my eyes grew heavy, and I was able to force myself to drift into sleep. I awoke the next morning, not even greeting my foster parents, and ran out towards the edge of the dome. However, my vision was obscured by a cloud of dust. It seemed as though a dust storm had struck, making the entire dome enveloped within a cloud of dirt. After about 30 minutes of desperate searching for the handprint, I gave up and rationalized that it must have actually been a dream. It was at this moment, though, that I saw a handprint form yet again, this time right before my eyes. I walked over to it, a mix of fear and anxiety brewing within me. This one handprint turned into 2, then 3, then 4, and so on, until an entire patch of the dome's western perimeter was covered in grimy, malformed handprints of all shapes and sizes. Not only was a portion of the wall covered, but the ceiling of the dome was too. And the sudden darkness caused a small crowd to survey the blockage. Classes were let out early that day, and officials began surrounding it, barricading any citizens from entering the immediate proximity. Officers began trying to figure out how the handprints were formed, along with how to remove them, as the mere sight of them was causing mass hysteria. Time appeared of the essence, as every few minutes or so, a new handprint would creep into the picture. Officials began sending out officers in life suits to attempt to remove the prints from the outside. Not a single officer who ventured on this expedition returned. With their tattered life suits coated in a variety of bodily fluids, being mockingly thrown back with each dispatch, though this was kept confidential to the public. The line was drawn, and officers ceased to be released when one life suit was returned intact, save for the notable absence of a key card. On the second day, we, as the public, realised that this was no ordinary dust storm. It had been 24 hours, and the dust had still yet to settle. Our vision was still obscured from the inside, and if not for our ability to tell the time, we'd have no idea if it was day or night. More concerning, however, was that in this span of time, another collection of handprints completely covered half of the dome, leading towards the exit door. When the third day struck, all of our livestock either went insane or dropped dead for no identifiable reason. Fearing the worst, my foster family, much like many others, stored and gathered as much food as they could. Markets were ransacked, and there weren't nearly enough officers or officials to stop the rioting. The dome was in a perpetual state of dusk, the only source of light coming from the dim sunlight that just barely forced its way through the cloud of dust and the spaces between fingers. The handprints had completely covered the dome, On the fourth day, we were greeted by the wailing shriek of sirens. All electricity was cut out from the dome, and it appeared as though the dust had thickened, along with the handprints seemingly layering onto each other, leaving the entire dome shrouded in shadow. All families were instructed to remain inside of their houses as the sirens softened, and a message was broadcasted to every radio in the community, the only piece of technology that appeared to be working. Feeling that this message would be of dire importance, I wrote down what was spoken. The following message is transmitted at the request of the officials in the Mender City Dome. This is not a drill. There is an imminent threat to the community in the form of... It was at this point that the message audibly degraded and became incomprehensible. The only thing breaking the silence of the dome was the static being emitted from the radio and the occasional jarring scream in the distance. After a few moments, the radio queued back up again, and an unnatural, raspy voice took hold. The speaker's voice was airy, ghostly even, and it painstakingly uttered every syllable of every word, while wheezing and breathing heavily, almost as if through debris, making sure to articulate their message perfectly so it could be heard over the ever-present white noise. The speaker stated, "You believe that we were gone, that we'd vanished away into the darkest recesses of your mind, a faded memory, a lost cause. You believe that we'd been whisked away at the cruel hands of light, of power, of warfare. You may have been right in that regard. We left you to fend for yourselves, as you did to us. Whether erased years gone, or expelled from your serenity, we let you know now. We have returned." The radio clip ended. The static ceased. Shocked, paralyzed, petrified. There wasn't a single noise coming from any household, save for the occasional whimper or gasp. Suddenly, the radio cut back in again. The static resumed, but among the static, we heard the sound of a heavy door creaking open, then a metallic slam, along with the sound of an army of footsteps trudging forth. The radio cut out again. Much like many others, my foster parents shot upstairs and grabbed our life suits. I quickly put it on, knowing that the exit door had been breached and that contaminated air was now pervading throughout our dome. We began barricading our doors, but then rationalized that if whatever was out there could get past the exit door, they could easily get past the few wooden planks and couches. I began scavenging for any weapons throughout the house, but seeing as guns were prohibited, I had to fend for myself using a measly steak knife. My family and I went into hiding, finding solace within our attic, the safest place we had in our house. The room contained nothing but a desk to the far right, a set of chairs, a spare radio, and a tinted window near the roof. We all huddled beneath the desk, praying to any god we could think of, and planning an escape route if need be. All we could hear from outside our house were blood-curdling screams, the sound of liquid hitting concrete, and the crackling of fire. The radios turned back on. Once again, nothing was audible, apart from the sound of static. This persisted for a few minutes, until the static changed to a rather cheery tune, almost as if whatever was out there was mocking us. I recognised the song from my earliest days, and amidst the chaos, I even chuckled a bit. On loop, Mr. Sandman by the Chordettes began playing. One of my favourite songs from my childhood, back before the war. That moment of joy, however, didn't last. As soon, the song looped over so many times that it felt like we were going deaf. We sat there for hours, with nothing but the sound of screaming and that damn 50s song pummeling our ears. Eventually, my curiosity got the best of me yet again. Slowly, I crept over to the tinted window and peered out into the ensuing anarchy. I was revolted by what I saw. Bodies thrown about, torn to bits within the streets. Tarred black corpses speckled in red, lining the sidewalks. With bodily fluids of all types, painting buildings in the distance like demented graffiti. The neighbourhood next to mine was in the midst of being ravaged by a militia of lost souls, and I knew that mine was next. I stepped away from the window, stricken with fear, and speechless from the chaos ensuing before my eyes. I slowly sat down yet again, next to my parents. Concerned, they looked at each other and rose up, cautiously walking towards the window. They both stared out that window for what felt like an eternity. Eventually, they both turned back and gazed at me, expressionless and with a mile-wide look in their eyes, almost as if neither one of them was all there anymore. Looking back at them, I noticed something. My father began to smirk. That smirk turned into a grin, and that grin turned into a sickening, devilish smile. He had a look in his eyes, different than any other I've ever seen on a person. He looked over at my mother, and then over at me, his eyes darting in all directions. He then began walking towards me, more jolting than anything. It looked almost as if with every step, he was attempting to dislodge a bone in his body. He stood before me, same maniacal grin on his face. "Dear, be a doll and give Daddy your weapon, okay?" I wasn't in the right frame of mind. No one was. I remained motionless, a surge of thoughts flying through my head, like a bullet through a flock of doves. I dropped my knife to the floor, not able to respond in any other way. My father picked up the knife, toyed with it a bit, like a child would with a Christmas present, and slit my mother's throat. I watched as this happened, not moving a muscle, and even worse, not caring. Blood spurted out of her neck like a faucet, the liquid getting on my suit and staining my soul. My father fell with her to the ground, tears streaming from his eyes, yet his smile remained. He looked over at me, apologised, and then did the honours by slitting his own neck. I looked down at their corpses, not saddened, not traumatised, hell, not even fazed. Eventually, I dragged myself to the tinted window, not willing to even glance at my foster parents' dishevelled bodies and ignoring the stench of death. So there I sat, watching as my neighbourhood was torn apart limb from limb by an army of pitch black, red-spotted carcasses, all deformed in different ways. It felt as though time had froze. I could see the world, yet nothing but chaos remained. I studied the grisly scene with my eyes, the last sight I believed I'd ever see. An army of tarred black carcasses, speckled red, tore through people's houses, each member looking different than the rest. All of them had a few distinct similarities. They all had beady, bloodshot eyes that could stare into the soul of even the most steadfast of individuals. All appeared to have unnatural strength, along with the tendency to spew an acidic substance out of their mouths that, as far as I could tell, melts any metal, fabric, or piece of flesh. Many had mutations, such as extra arms, sharpened claws for hands, or even no hands at all. Others had abnormally large legs and used them to stomp through their prey's heads. Many were capable of climbing or walking on walls, whether sideways or completely upside down, defying all known laws of physics. The only other thing I noticed was they weren't slaughtering us for food, as I never saw them devour any human flesh. They were doing it for fun. They were relentless in their ways and showed absolutely no remorse or mercy. They had vengeance on their minds, or at least what was left of them. I sat there at the window, waiting for the forced entry of my home, waiting for the sweet release of death. I shut my eyes, expecting to hear the sweet sound of my door breaking down and of my stairs being trudged upon. Yet nothing happened. There was complete silence for the first time, save for the sound of Mr. Sandman bludgeoning my ears like a sledgehammer. I opened my eyes and directed my attention outside. The entire army parked themselves in front of my house, watching my every move. I looked down at them, finally accepting my fate, and motioned for them to get my death over with. Yet once again, nothing happened. They just stood there, staring at me with beady, bloodshot eyes. They remained there, not budging for hours, and I realized that they were waiting me out, forcing me to come to them, knowing that I didn't have enough food to survive forever. We were locked in a stalemate, but I wasn't going to just give up and give them that satisfaction. They were going to have to wait it out with me. And even if I was prolonging the inevitable, it at least made me feel as though I got the last laugh. Now we're here. I've sat in this attic for days now, surviving off of nothing but canned beans and fruit. The only way I've been able to keep my sanity has been writing this. At least now, I have something to do with myself. Something to preoccupy me from taking that steak knife and plunging it into my chest. Even if that means writing this memoir over and over again. Every now and then, I'll look out of my window at that unforgiving army and drift off into thought. I look back at my fondest memories and remember how even in the wake of chaos, and after all of the adversity we'd all faced, life was simpler then. For more terrifying creepypasta horror stories, check out the playlist or the video on screen.